There's a special kind of cold reserved for the child who doesn't fit the family portrait. My name is Julia Foster. I returned home seeking connection, but I walked into a conspiracy. In the house where I grew up, I am a ghost. My parents celebrate my brother's every move, while my own existence is sacrificed for his ambition. I thought it was just neglect until I heard them whispering. They aren't just ignoring me. They are actively trying to erase me from the family legacy. I feel ambushed by my own blood. What do you do when the people who should protect you are the ones holding the knife? Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The polished oak door of my childhood home felt cold under my hand, a familiar weight that no longer felt like a welcome. I'd driven 12 hours back to this town, swallowing my pride and a decent amount of highway coffee, all for Mom's anniversary party. I'd told myself it was a chance to reconnect to bridge the gap that had widened since I'd left for the city. But the moment I stepped inside, the air was thick with the same suffocating tension I remembered. Ethan was holding court in the living room, his laugh too loud, my mother Margaret hanging on his every word. My father Robert offered me a brief, distracted hug. "Julia, you made it." His eyes were already scanning the room for someone more important. At the dinner table, the dynamic crystallized. "Ethan just closed the biggest deal of his quarter," Mom announced, beaming. "We're just so proud." Clinking glasses, murmurs of congratulations. I'd just had my research published in a respected journal, a milestone in my career, but when I mentioned it, Mom just smiled vaguely. "That's nice, dear. More wine, Ethan." It wasn't just that they favored him, it was the way they seemed to erase my achievements entirely, as if they didn't fit the family narrative. Later, Dad pulled out old photo albums. "Look at this," he chuckled, pointing to a picture of Ethan on a podium. "Always a winner." He flipped past a photo of me winning the state science fair, my face blurred as his hand brushed over it. "Your brother always knew what he wanted." My own memories felt minimized, my contributions painted over. It was a subtle, constant invalidation. A sharp memory, vivid as a splinter, surfaced. I was 17, my art portfolio clutched in my hands. I'd been accepted into a prestigious summer program. My parents had sat me down, their faces a mask of pragmatic concern. "Julia, we know you love your art," Dad had said, his voice gentle, "and we will always support you." But weeks later, that support vanished. The money set aside for my program was diverted to Ethan for a networking trip that looked more like a vacation. "It's a critical opportunity for him, honey," Mom had explained, not meeting my eyes. "You understand?" I hadn't understood. I'd felt betrayed. Now, standing in this house, I realized it wasn't a one-time event. It was a pattern. I was the supporting character in their story, my needs and my identity constantly ambushed by the expectations and ambitions they had for my brother. My voice was disregarded, my presence a footnote. I stepped onto the cold back porch, the muffled party noise a dull ache behind me. I pulled out my phone, my fingers flying as I texted Alex. "It's happening again. Am I crazy or am I invisible?" His reply came almost instantly. "You're not crazy. You're the most visible person I know. Don't let them dim your light, Jay." His words were a lifeline, a connection to a world where I wasn't defined by my family's blind spots. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. The sorrow that had been my constant companion on these trips home was shifting, hardening into something else. A quiet, simmering anger. I wasn't a child anymore. I wouldn't let them just wipe me away. I headed back inside, intending to grab my coat and leave. I was done for the night. As I passed my father's study, I heard voices, low, urgent. "Ethan." And my parents. "She doesn't need to know," Ethan was saying, his tone dismissive. "It's handled." "But the lake house," Mom started, her voice hesitant. Margaret, it's for the best. Ethan cut in, his charm replaced by steel. We need the capital for my new expansion. Julia was never interested in it anyway. I've already got the papers drawn up for you to sign. My blood ran cold. The lake house wasn't just property. It was my one sanctuary, the only place I'd ever felt truly seen, and he was taking it, manipulating them into cutting me out completely. I didn't sleep. The shock from Ethan's words solidified into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just going to be angry. I was going to be smart. The next morning, I waited until my father left for his golf game and my mother was busy in the garden. His study, usually locked, was ajar. Ethan's arrogance had made him sloppy. I didn't know what I was looking for, but the papers he'd mentioned were a start. It didn't take long. In his top desk drawer, under a stack of unread journals, was a file labeled Family Properties. Inside, it wasn't just about the lake house. It was a roadmap of Ethan's schemes, emails from him to my parents outlining his expansion, convenient analyses, showing why selling the house was the only option, and drafts of documents that steadily minimized my stake in everything. I found him by the pool, scrolling through his phone as if he didn't have a care in the world. I heard you in the study last night, Ethan. He didn't look up. Lower your voice, Julia. You're selling the lake house. You're lying to them and cutting me out. He finally lowered his phone, his smile a tight, condescending mask. You're overreacting, as usual. It's a simple business decision, something you wouldn't understand. I understand that it's half mine. Is it? He said, his voice dropping. Be careful, Julia. It would be a shame if all this emotional instability started to worry people who matter. It's a small world. A bad reputation can be so threatening. I recoiled as if he'd slapped me. The veiled threat to my career, my life back in the city, was unmistakable. The tension at lunch was so thick I could barely breathe. I tried to appeal to reason. Mom, Dad, I said, my voice shaking slightly. We need to talk about the lake house. Margaret set her fork down with a sharp click. Julia, we are not discussing this. Ethan is under a great deal of pressure and he has presented a plan that secures this family's future. We all need to make adjustments. But he's lying to you. That is enough. Her voice was sharp. She openly sacrificed any pretense of fairness for his image. We are supporting your brother. It's what a family does. Your father and I have already made our decision. I looked at Robert, desperate for an ally. He just stared at his plate, meticulously cutting his food, his silence a resounding confirmation. I was alone in this. The feeling of being completely ambushed by my own family was suffocating. They weren't just blind to his manipulation, they were partners in it. I fled to my room and called Alex, the words tumbling out of me. They don't care. They're just letting him. They're helping him. Because you're playing their game, Jay, Alex said, his voice firm and grounding. You can't appeal to their emotions. They've already chosen. You need strategy. What's the legal status of the house? What are your rights? You need concrete evidence. He was right. This wasn't just about my feelings. It was about challenging the systemic injustice that had defined my entire life. I had to act not just for the house, but for every time I'd been told to be quiet, to be nice. That night I went back to the study. I needed something undeniable. I dug deeper past the organized files into the chaotic mess of my father's old correspondence. In a forgotten desk drawer tucked inside an old tax return, I found it. It was a single sheet of paper, a notarized letter. A formal, legal-sounding declaration supposedly from me stating my intention to relinquish all future claims to the lake house property dated 3 months ago. The signature at the bottom was a passable forgery of my own. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just manipulation. This was fraud. He had manufactured a document to erase me from my own life. My hands were shaking, the forged letter clutched in my fist when my phone vibrated on the desk. A text from an unknown number. But I knew who it was from. I know what you're doing. Stop digging. If you pursue this, I will ruin everything. And I mean everything. The anniversary party was in full swing, the garden glittering with fairy lights. My mother was laughing, holding a champagne flute as my father prepared to make a toast. This was the image they prized: perfect, successful, united. Ethan's text message was a cold weight in my pocket, but his threat had backfired. It didn't scare me. It ignited me. This was the high-stakes event he lived for, and it would be the one I used to pull the rot into the light. I waited until my father raised his glass. "To 50 years, he began. "I have something to say." My voice cut through the polite murmur. The music faltered. Every eye turned to me. Ethan's smile froze his eyes, instantly turning to ice. "Julia," my mother hissed, her smile painted on, "don't make a scene. This is our night." "I'm not making a scene. I'm telling the truth." I walked to the center of the patio, my hands steady. For years I have allowed myself to be pushed aside, to be minimized. I've allowed my accomplishments to be ignored while Ethan's were celebrated. I've allowed my needs to be sacrificed for his ambitions. "Julia, you're hysterical," Ethan said, laughing it off, appealing to the crowd. "She gets these ideas." "I'm not hysterical." I pulled the folded paper from my pocket. "I am, however, holding a document Ethan forged." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. I held it up. "This is a letter supposedly from me relinquishing all my rights to the lake house. He faked my signature so he could sell it and fund his new project without my consent." I looked directly at my parents. "And you were going to let him?" Ethan moved toward me, his charm vaporizing, revealing the venom beneath. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You're unstable, Julia. You always have been." He turned to the guests. "My sister, unfortunately, has been struggling with jealousy. It's a sad thing to watch." He was trying to publicly humiliate me, to paint me as the crazy, vindictive sister. But I wasn't the same person who had arrived here. "Stop talking, Julia. You're embarrassing yourself," my mother commanded, her face pale with rage. She was trying to erase the confrontation, to shove the truth back into the shadows. "This is a private family matter." "It stopped being private when he committed fraud," I stated, my voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even me. "It stopped being private when you chose to enable a thief over protecting your daughter. How many times have you done this? How many times have you told me to be quiet? I will not be erased anymore." I locked eyes with Ethan. "Your threats don't work. You don't control me." The silence was absolute. My parents stood frozen, their perfect party shattered. My father looked ashamed but still silent. My mother's expression was one of pure fury, not at Ethan, but at me for exposing them. The betrayal was no longer a quiet ache. It was a screaming public wound. All the pain, all the years of feeling ambushed and invisible, coalesced into a single clarifying moment. The anger didn't burn me, it forged me. This wasn't about winning them back. It was about claiming my own narrative. I felt a profound, painful catharsis. I had spoken. I was visible. The spell was broken. Guests began to murmur, finding excuses to leave. The party was over. As people filed out, a man I recognized, Mr. Henderson, a major figure in my own industry, and a close friend of my father's, paused beside me. His expression wasn't sympathetic. It was cold. "Julia," he said, his voice low, "Ethan mentioned you were having some professional difficulties, that you were becoming unreliable. I'm on the board for that new research grant you applied for." My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the family. Ethan's threatening messages weren't a promise, they were a confirmation. He had already been working in the shadows, poisoning my reputation, my career. The confrontation was over, but I realized his manipulations ran deeper and wider than I could have ever imagined. The house was morgue quiet after the last guest fled. I packed my bag in a daze, the adrenaline draining away, leaving a hollow, echoing sorrow. The fracture was clean, irreparable. Downstairs, my mother was sweeping up a broken champagne flute, her back rigid. "I hope you're happy, Julia," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You've finally torn this family apart." She still didn't see it. She would never see it. She was trying to erase the truth of the night, recasting me as the villain. My father was in his study, the door closed. He never came out. There was no confrontation, no final plea, just the suffocating weight of his silence. I felt a pang of relief mixed with the sorrow. I wasn't just leaving, I was escaping. I drove through the night, a long, dark stretch of highway separating me from that house. I called Alex, my voice hoarse. "It's done," I said. "I did it." He didn't cheer. He just listened, a steady presence on the other end of the line, and when I was finished, he just said, "I'm here, Jay. I'll be here." In that moment, I knew I was redefining my boundaries. Family wasn't the blood I shared with people who would so easily sacrifice me. It was the trust I was building with Alex, the community I'd chosen for myself. The backlash was immediate. The residual threats Ethan had promised were not idle. The first thing I did when I got back to my apartment was contact a lawyer. The forged document was my anchor, a piece of irrefutable truth. My lawyer was blunt. "This is a clean-cut case of fraud, Julia, but it will be ugly. It would mean a formal public fight." Then I dealt with the grant. I knew Ethan and Mr. Henderson were already poisoning the well. I couldn't let their narrative take root. I compiled my complete research portfolio, letters of commendation from my actual mentors, and a personal statement. I sent it directly to the grant board chair, and I addressed the elephant in the room. I didn't accuse, I stated facts. I am currently in a severe familial dispute involving financial fraud, which may be the source of any unprofessional rumors you may have heard. My work stands for itself. It was the biggest risk of my life, but it was my only move. I was done being ambushed. I was taking proactive measures to protect my interests, my dignity, and my future. In the quiet evenings that followed, the weight of my reflection was heavy. I'd spent my entire life starving for my parents' approval for a single moment where they would choose me. I realized now that their approval wasn't love. It was a currency they used for control. My emotional clarity had been bought at a terrible price, but it was worth more than their conditional validation. I was asserting myself, and for the first time I felt whole, even if I was hurting. A few days later, a text came in from my Aunt Clara, my father's sister, who had been at the party. That took more courage than I've ever seen in that house. "Your grandfather would have been proud of you." It wasn't a reconciliation, not really. But it was a small, vital acknowledgement. A crack of light. It provided a nuance I hadn't expected. I wasn't entirely alone in my old world, even if the main pillars had crumbled. I was sitting at my desk, having just hit send on a follow-up email to my lawyer, when a new message popped into my inbox. The subject line made my heart stop. It was from a leading research institute, one I'd admired from afar for years. "Dear Dr. Foster, we were deeply impressed by your recent publication on synaptic plasticity. Coupled with a strong personal recommendation from Dr. Alex Rivera, we would like to invite you to discuss a senior research position. An opportunity has just opened. I read it 3 times. It wasn't just a job, it was a new chapter, an escape route, a promise of a future I had built myself, not one I had to beg for. It was the first sign of genuine triumph." 6 months later, I stood in my own lab, the clean, sterile scent of potential, a stark contrast to the stale air of my childhood home. I had taken the position at the research institute, moved to a new city, and poured every ounce of my energy into work that mattered. The institute didn't just give me a job, they gave me a voice, putting my research on the fast track for a new grant, the very one Mr. Henderson had tried to block. My lawyer had handled the fraud claim with brutal efficiency. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the threat of criminal charges, Ethan had folded. He'd been forced into a settlement, buying me out of my half of the lake house at a price that made his eyes water. It was a victory, but a hollow one. I hadn't heard from my parents since the party, not a single call or text. The silence was its own answer. But the fear that used to define me, the constant dread of being ambushed by their disapproval or Ethan's next move, was gone. I was no longer a participant in their toxic games. My contributions were now being recognized in papers and at conferences, in spaces where merit was the only currency. I was no longer being erased. I was being actively sought out. I still carried the scars. There were nights when I reflected on the complexity of it all, the tangled mess of love and betrayal, the way a family can become a system for enabling its most threatening member. I mourned the family I should have had, the parents who should have protected me. I understood now that they were weak, trapped by their own obsession with appearances, willing to sacrifice their own daughter to maintain a fragile illusion. But I refused to let resentment build a new prison for me. I embraced the hard-won freedom, the profound self-respect that came from choosing my own integrity over their broken version of loyalty. The resilience I had been forced to learn, the moral courage Alex had always seen in me, these were the values that defined my new life, a life built on my own terms. "You're going to need a bigger frame for the next one," Alex said, handing me a glass of wine. He'd flown in to help me celebrate. We were in my new apartment, a bright, airy space that was entirely my own. My recently published journal, the one my mother had dismissed, was now professionally framed and hanging on the wall by my desk. It was a tangible symbol of a personal achievement they could never touch. "To Dr. Foster," he toasted, his smile genuine and proud, "and to building your own damn house." We clinked glasses, the sound sharp and clear. I looked around the room at the boxes still waiting to be unpacked, at the view of a city that held nothing but promise. The ache of what I'd lost was still there, a thin, silver line of grief, but it was overshadowed by the vibrant, solid reality of what I had gained. I was finally, unequivocally on my own side. I was finally visible, not just to them, but to myself. A difficult but necessary journey to reclaim oneself. What did you think of Julia's stand against her family? We truly read all of your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe for more. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.